Hello and welcome to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers play games from the past and talk about their impact and relevance today. I'm Tim Longo, and I'm joined, as always, by a man who thought so much about whether we could do this podcast that he never stopped to think about whether we should.
Brett Duville, and I feel like I should be playing a little bit of Jurassic Park music right about here.
Nice, there you go. It was. I told Brett pre-show this is definitely a dot connecting exercise. I was thinking dinosaurs. There's T-Rexes. What? Lost World, Lost Valley, Jurassic Park, and that's one of my favorite.
Is definitely well, that's an old fantasy, right? To have a lost civilization, and I think it's Arthur Conan Doyle who has the lost. It's actually called the Lost World, right?
I think so. Yeah, and Journey to the Center of the Earth and all that. But definitely Michael Crichton inspiration there for sure. But that's also one of my favorite quotes from any movie, the old Jeff Goldblum. So yeah, it was a stretch, but I'm
more of a big fan of him.
Of course, we're talking
down over Laura Dern's hand.
That's also good. Chaos theory. Yeah. Some of the best chaos theory explanation of all time as well, followed by ripples in water from a T-Rex. So we're continuing to talk about Tomb Raider, the first Tomb Raider game, 1996.
Correct.
Our second session, and full disclosure, I was out for a little bit, so I didn't get to fully catch up through Greece as we were supposed to play through. So I am to Greece now and have started Greece, but I am not. I have not completed it. I've also had forgotten how long Peru was, to be honest. So
yeah, the levels are a lot bigger than I remembered, for sure. And then there was also there are encounters and things that I had forgotten about. So we'll get to some of that, I think. But the first thing, and one of the things that we kind of put off, was the level design. And in particular, I think one of the things I really appreciate about this game is both the sort of labyrinthine nature of these levels and how they all connect up. And I know that that's total catnip for you, so I'll let you take that one. For me, the things I really admire are things like when that boulder comes down at the temple of Kuala something,
Kualapec.
You run out and you're sort of terrified of that, and you're trying to get out of the way, and that's when you see that there's a switch on the wall, right? Is that it leads you in that direction because you've been chased out of this hall, and it's a switch that you can't see going the other direction unless you really take a look around and kind of walk out far enough to even see it, because it's kind of blocked by geometry. And that's the sort of thing that I really love, is like the way an artist directs your eye. But I wonder which of these Peru levels you particularly like.
Well, I mentioned the city of Vilcabamba last time as being kind of an influencer for me, just as a level designer, as I started working on indie. And yeah, I think you nailed it with your earlier point about the interconnectedness of the game in general. And I think the sense, again, the biggest checkbox that this game had for me and still has for me, because I really have enjoyed going back through Peru again, even though I don't know how many times I've played it, and I forget moments, but once I go through the level, kind of it all, I remember it all and kind of remember where certain things are and stuff, even though I did forget a couple small things. But the sense of exploration, and I think the level design is a big part of that, because of the way, especially in Lost Valley, though there is one big elephant in the room we have to talk about when it comes to one of our common topics when it comes to puzzles, is order of operation for lock and key, which is a common problem with this level that we definitely studied at Crystal. And I can't overstate enough, rather, Tomb Raider Anniversary for anyone who's played this game and and loves the original Tomb Raider. If they haven't played the remake that Crystal did, it's a great distillation of this original game. It's very much in the spirit of it, led by Jason Bada. But and all of the moments you remember from the original are in Anniversary, but just updated and redone. Basically, it's one of the early kind of remakes. It's a full remake, not a a remaster. But anyway, you can, in the Lost Valley, you can, because of that exploration goal that they have, where you really get this sense of place and things are interconnected, and you can kind of come at things, you can approach things, and to Brett's point, they do a pretty good job most of the time of presenting you with your sort of problems and your options, and then you spend most of your time sussing out how to get to a place, or you see an opening up above, in a certain area, and you're like, how do I get up there? Sometimes, unfortunately, you see the opening, and then how you get up there actually is a different direction, and you end up coming back through that opening from above. And so there's been a couple times when I've forgotten that, and I've spent too much time trying to get someplace that I actually am going to come through the opposite direction. Right. You know what I mean? So it's kind of false telegraphing in that way. But with the Lost Valley specifically, you can go to the valley itself before you get to the gear puzzle. And so you can go and find the gears, and you're like, well, what do I do with these gears? And it turns out you have to go all the way back to the beginning of the level, go up that stream, and you find the gear puzzle up there, or at least the place where you put the gears.
And
so that's kind of that.
I was running around collecting those, and the problem with that, more than anything else, is you don't know how many you're going to need, and so you don't know when you're done and when you should go back and look for whatever these are for. Although there is sort of an adventure game trope that adventure gamers would know, that things come in threes, right? That's generally how this works. But they break that in the first level of Greece. So it's in the first level of Greece, there's 4 things you need. So it's just, I don't know. It's sort of weird that way. It's very clear that you need that in Greece, but it's still one of those things where you're like, oh, okay. I'm not used to it being that way. Anyway.
I think something we were a lot more forgiving back then, and also I think ended up being, for those who weren't forgiving, there's many places in this game that were basically wall missions, as we've talked about before, where you basically would get stuck and would frustrate people. And I know it happened to many of us, in the original playthroughs of these. And then you just put the game down, because there's not a really good way to understand what to do next. Probably hint books and stuff at the time were really the solution. But yeah, that presentation of those gears, what ended up eating a lot of time in my memory, at least, especially for myself in these games, was a lot of back and forth. Because you go and you might find 2 gears, and then you go and you find the puzzle, and you're like, oh wait, there's a third peg here. Oh man, I guess I got to go all the way back. And so you kind of are assessing that stuff out if you didn't do things in the correct order, even though in that particular level, they do present you with the stream right as you come into the level. So they are trying to encourage you to go upstream and find what's up there first. But very easily, if you fall on the stream, they're now encouraging you to keep going, because they've dumped you down the waterfall, and you're like, well, I guess I'm supposed to be here. And so you just keep running around.
Well, or in my case, I actually, because I was trained to look for secrets, right? Because that's part of the goal of the game. There's a way you can climb up immediately and actually go to the right and go to the valley first without seeing the gears, just by climbing, and then climbing down some sort of stone steps.
Yeah, that's what I did too. Yeah.
So you don't have to fall.
But I mean, even if you fall, but I mean, if you're good at climbing and observant, and you can nail that in the first try, then you can do that. And probably, I don't know what the percentage would be, but anyone who tried to jump over the waterfall and doesn't, or the stream, and it's just kind of interesting that they are pushing you away. They're pushing you away from where they actually want you to go.
No, that's a good point. So anyway, I hadn't thought of it that way, because by the time I got to that point, I knew that I had to be going there. I had sort of recollected, oh, that's right, this is kind of this weird thing, and I just was saving before I did all those jumps and just
yeah,
making sure. Oh, I missed it. Forget it. I'll just go ahead and load that again. So I definitely
yeah.
avoided that issue that way.
Oh man, the PlayStation version of this game is so punishing because of that stuff, because of the save gems.
Right.
Like, I don't recall there being enough of those, and so man, you're having to you waste a lot of time if you miss jumps and stuff. But anyway, as an aside note, but I ended up being a little critical of level design there. Sorry, but on the positive side, for both City of Vilcabamba and Tomb of Qualopec specifically, as I kind of referenced in the first episode, I really appreciate the sort of like presenting you with the problem. And in the City of Vilcabamba being one example where you very clearly come into that one temple sort of facade front and you see the doors, closed doors. And you're like, okay, there's one open, I believe is how it starts. And so you really can only go one way, but you can glean that you're going to probably open the other two doors somehow and most likely systematically. So you basically spend your time going through the temple and kind of the twists and turns and, like you said, all the interconnectedness of it, and then you get this sense like the tomb / temple itself is almost like a puzzle box that you're slowly solving, with each successive step. And I just love that kind of level design. And the thing that they get away with, which we ran into, admittedly, Crystal ran into when they inherited the franchise, and then with Legend and the first games, but especially with the reboot, because we were going for more of an ultra real feel. They get away with a lot in this game of how the level is structured because of its low poly / abstract / I don't really care about the sense of place as much in the details, because there's, none of the rooms make sense. There's hallways that go twist and turn that are just there to get you where they want you to get you, probably because the geometry needed to go that way. There's other than the temple fronts and occasionally there's a good, like the valley, the Lost Valley's obviously a cool space and stuff, but they get away with a lot of hand waviness because you just don't scrutinize the reality of things. Right. And that starts biting you more and more as the franchise goes on, because the spaces need to be, believable.
Right. And so, it's a post like Half-Life era where the spaces, the demands of the spaces, even low poly spaces, have more.
Yeah, got bigger.
There's more expected there.
That's a good point. We're not as forgiving, and we've had good examples, right? Of you can still have a sense of place and logic to things, and it actually really makes it much better. So yeah, that's a good point. You didn't have to wait that long to see that, because that was 98,
just 2 years later. So it wasn't long, and they were already probably working on it when this came out. I think that's true. They may have still been kind of in storyland, as I recall, but or just sort of outline land. But
yeah. So. But I just like it helped them a lot, and I definitely am interested in your thoughts on the engine itself, because it's such a weird, different engine compared to everything else because of its block grid nature, and angular. I mean, we can talk about it as we go, but it's just such a fascinating, weird thing, because the reason I bring it up in this context, because it dictates their level design to a large degree, right? The way they deal with angles, everything's on a grid and cube based, but then they have some control over the slopes and angles of those slopes. So they're kind of trying to make a cave, look like a cave out of Lego pieces, if you will, or something. But like the game of the same year with Mario, they kind of just made, in their whatever 3D package they used or 3D tool they used, they made a object, and they weren't constrained in the same way. But this, so it's still kind of a feat that we get even a little bit of a sense that we're in Peru with this weird engine.
That's absolutely a great point. I mean, so a couple things. One is, I believe the Nintendo 64 had somewhat more advanced hardware, because it was based on the Silicon Graphics hardware. So I think they were a little bit ahead of the curve on what the 3D could do. And they also commit to a lot less texture usage and therefore get more performance out of the polygons they do have. And that's part of an aesthetic that they chose, right? So there's a couple of different things going on there. And then as far as making it block-based and grid-based, one of the reasons I can imagine was going on there is that if you do that, then you can actually just number all your faces, give every face a number, which is what its normal is, for example, what direction it faces.
Mm-hmm.
And now your clipping, or backface culling rather, is very easy because you just know, oh, I only want the ones that are marked 1, 6, and 9, or whatever, and I can ignore all the other ones because I know I'm facing this direction. So you basically get sort of half your backface culling basically for free without having to do any math or store extra data about the space. You only store one number instead of 3 for a full vector determining that you would dot against the camera direction to determine if you needed to cull something, backface cull something or not. So that was my guess. I suspect it was also somewhat easier to build that way in a lot of cases. Like your general case was probably faster to build. And yes, doing some of the interiors was probably hard and something that's meant to look more organic, like the Lost Valley. But in general, when you're in tombs and temples and they're fairly rectilinear, I think it's probably a lot easier. So I think there's some trade-offs there that just make things easier.
Yeah. It's got a kind of it's got a voxel kind of look about it.
Does.
You know what I mean? And it kind of is always felt like a macro voxel kind of feel. And the other note I wrote down to ask you about in this regard while we're on the topic is potentially collision simplification. And the reason I asked about that is kind of she is directly interacting with the world a lot. And how they detect that, and obviously maybe that's not really a collision check or whatever, but having her, having all of her animations and everything sync up appropriately when she is interacting with the world, I would think is much easier when it's grid and block based. Separate from even just the visual rendering.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. It's also a lot easier with a grid-based world to know exactly what you're going to need to test. And there are good data structures for how things link up to do that. So it makes it a lot more optimal to be able to go and look and say, oh, I'm going to need to test face X, face Y, face Z, and only those faces. And similarly for some of the like you said, some of the interactions she does, she needs to, she can walk right up to an edge if you walk her and things like that. And that's easier to do if you know that you're on a grid and how far you're going to have to go before you even have to test what the next grid block is. So there are definitely, there's definitely value there and some performance optimization. I think a lot of that dropped off as the series went on and people became more comfortable with the hardware and what it could do. I'll go ahead and issue the correction now because we're talking a little bit about sort of that. But the PlayStation 1, as I had mentioned last time, I thought it had some sort of 3D math. It in fact had a 3D math coprocessor. So that was basically a chip sitting right next to the chip. It wasn't really a full GPU for just that. But it did have hardware polygon rasterization and texturing. And that in particular meant it had good enough performance to render. A software renderer of the speed that the main chip the PlayStation is probably wouldn't be able to render fast enough. Even a world this simple. So I went and looked that up this week because I was definitely a little uncertain about it, and I never had to program for that system, so it's not sort of embedded in my memory. Whereas the PS2, I can tell you an awful lot about the PS2. I remember that machine pretty well, but the not so much the PS1 because I kind of came along too late for that. So or we made the switch to PlayStation much later than that. We didn't ship Starfighter, my first game, for the PS1. So Anyway,
Yeah.
so I thought I'd throw that out there for those out there who are checking my technical notes. Definitely the case that it was an accelerated system. But as Tim and I were talking about in pre-show, it really looks way blockier than other things. A lot of that has to do with its limited memory. And so the story there is probably more complicated, because I know this was a system that was announced at a price lower than I think the suits wanted it to be announced. I think they had, the famous story is that the executive in charge of announcing the price just came out and said $299 and whatever the date was at E3 or something like that, and promptly lost his job because it was $100.
Oh, I didn't know that.
$100 lower. That, I don't know if that's apocryphal, but I remember that being the story I heard back at the time.
So. Those stories are always a crack up. I'm sure, yeah, it could be true. It's just funny, this industry. We were talking in pre-show just about the sort of the 3D effect, the night and day difference between 3D effects and PlayStation, and yeah, some of it. I think as I'm trying in my memory, and I need to do some side by sides maybe just to kind of zero in on it. I actually still have my copy of the PlayStation 1 version, so I should crack that out. But it's a combination of resolution and aliasing differences as well as the texturing, because the texturing, I believe, was pretty pixelated compared to the 3D effects stuff, and so it just gives you the illusion, that it's a lot more high fidelity than it really is.
Yeah.
And anyway, yeah. But I just like the fidelity of her animation interactions with the world is another note I wrote down of just like, not necessarily revelatory, but Mario, I think the advantage that luckily we've already played that game, so he controls beautifully for its era and for what they were trying to do for a 3D platformer, and and you just get this sense of playfulness there. And she doesn't control well, but sure, the fidelity of her animations and interactions with the world blow him away.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's almost like two complete. We probably talked about this when we played Mario. They're basically two complete opposite ways to accomplish this sort of era of gaming, and so fascinating that they came out in the same year, and just what they both kind of did for the industry when it comes to sort of forks in the road,
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where we ended up now. I guess there's hybrids, and you're kind of trying to do both. And as I mentioned last episode, I think for the reboot where we talked about how do you retain the sort of the realism of her movement and mobility, but also give the player some gameplay control. So we kind of added air steering back in, which I forgot until starting this back up for the podcast, that you actually have air steering in this game, while in the Legend, Anniversary, and Underworld games that Crystal did, they took air steering essentially out. There might have been a little bit, but because they're trying to get those animations to line up to the jumps and stuff. So it's really fascinating. In this game, they don't mind if things don't line up perfectly. If you don't hit a jump perfectly, or you can hit a wall and she bounces off of it and stuff, you can jump to your doom. And
yeah, there is. I mean, part of that is the aesthetic of getting more play out of it, because you're just going to die and you're just going to have to do it better this time, right? I mean, that's definitely a gameplay aesthetic of the era, and not something that really flies today. There was a room in the temple of Qualipec that was driving me bonkers, because I could see what I was supposed to do, and it was just that I hadn't yet worked out the move to do that. There's a standing jump that you sort of have to press the arrow. You have to be stopped at the edge and then press the arrow and the jump key at the same time to get that, to get the perfect jump for that distance. Otherwise she jumps too far and she bounces basically. And that was driving me up a wall. If I had been playing that on the PlayStation, that would have been a wall for me. Because you have to play so there it's not fatal. So I guess that's the saving grace, is that you could presumably just run around and try it again and again and again. But I must have tried it at least a dozen times and maybe more when I was just reloading. Like, oh, I missed it again. I just reload from on top of there because I knew I was missing something, couldn't figure out what it was. It's not, I don't remember that being well described in the manual. So,
No,
but
there's a lot of sub.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, there's a lot of, like you were going to say, the submotion. I mean, one of the things that's kind of exciting about her as a character is you can make her jump in lots of different ways. I haven't found a lot of need for some of them to navigate the environment, but they do lend a sense of sort of how acrobatic the character is. And so there's a sense that she's just super capable, right? And that's reinforced by cutscenes but also just her pure moveset. The jumping sideways and somersaulting sideways in the air is gratuitous, really. I haven't found a use for it really. Maybe in combat, I guess, but
combat is probably the best use. Yeah.
So.
There's some moments, like there's that one, I think in the first in just the caves section, isn't there a timed door where you press you pull a lever and then the door opens to your left, but it's across a gap. Do you remember that? And you kind of have to jump down.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The most obvious way is to jump down and run over and get up there, but you can do a side jump there over to a block and then another side jump or something like that, I think, and you can do it more quickly.
Okay, yeah. No, I did it more straight ahead for sure.
Yeah, it's just the cool thing, the sort of both nerve-wracking thing about her controls, and maybe this is a good segue, we can talk about some of that. And nerve-wracking thing and also kind of cool thing about it is that it really is completely in the player's hands. As opposed to, though I love the game, some of the decisions Crystal made early on when they took the franchise before the reboot was they took some of the control out of the player's hands for making sure that things, the fidelity of things were cool and everything lined up well. But it meant, you really had to hit things when they wanted you to hit things. But here, like, your doom is really in your hands. There's a lot. It's very finicky because you have to be standing sometimes, like you said with that one example, you have to be standing in the right place and do the exact same or the exact right move to make the jump or whatever. But it is still very, open to you to figure that out and fail or not. It's not very handholdy, which we talk a lot about on the podcast. And it's also very like, you jumble your fingers up sometimes when you're trying to press all the keys you need to press to do the one thing you need to do, because you have to, press like 4 buttons at the same time, 4 keys at the same time, or in quick succession, and one false move and you're goner sometimes. And it gets worse as the game goes on too.
Oh, and that would have been worse at the time too, because keyboards back then were often couldn't accept more than one key input at a time.
Oh,
which is
right.
why the control and alt keys are leaned on heavily, because those are separately wired usually. So you're kind of like, oh, that's why you can use shift, control, alt, and arrow all at one time. But if you tried to do, one of the most frustrating things about playing keyboard rhythm games where there were some activity where you had to press 2 keys alternating or something like that was that they were nearly impossible because the keyboards were so lousy, and they didn't respond super well, and so track and field was a nightmare, for example.
Yeah, let's talk about her controls some. We kind of started getting on that topic, but what are your, coming back to it after so long? What are some of the pros and cons? She's got tank. We talked a little bit about it, Resident Evil, in the past episode, and largely we could describe it as tank controls. You're kind of driving her forward and then, turning her, and then I'll make a point later about footfalls and how they deal with animation syncing and stuff. Right. But what's your, how are you finding
that's actually the biggest thing, although it's something that you learn over time, is you have to trust the grid and rely on the information that the grid is telling you. It takes her 2 running steps from a standstill to cross a grid square. And so that if you go right up to an edge, if it's a difficult jump, and there was one in particular in Greece that I'm thinking of, where if you miss it, it's death. There are actually a few of those there. you know that if you walk up to the edge and then do her sort of full speed backwards, right, 2 steps, now you're exactly at the right spot to run and jump off the edge. So you know when to
that's a
key.
Pro tip for sure. Yeah.
So it's things like that I mean, on the one hand, it does take a little getting used to, but on the other, once you can read the world that way, like you're seeing through the matrix, as it were, you can just do it and just go and execute cleanly there every time, because you know exactly how it lines up. Once you get that into your head. So yeah. How about you?
Well, I think that the subtopic I wanted to bring up, that I think this is probably one of the best games to, I think, bring this topic up for the industry, and it was one of the first ones that I think broached this topic and made it a bit of a not a controversy, but a debate on a given team, especially in the 90s and early aughts. But it's really that balance and debate and discussion on a team about fidelity and accuracy versus gameplay responsiveness. And, you know, talking about this and Mario are great examples because, like I said earlier, they're sort of opposites of that spectrum. Mario focused on responsiveness and more of the Twitch platformer. And so when you press the button, he's going to jump no matter what animation syncing is going on, and they're just going to eat it on the minimal amount of fidelity of whether a frame ends too quickly, or whether he finished that footfall or what have you. And in this game, they prioritized, basically when I press that jump button, she's going to plant her foot down before she jumps. And so the responsiveness is not the same.
Right.
Once, like Brett said, once you learn the rule set, you are sort of protected from that because you kind of understand what you need to do. But if if you're looking for that sort of like, I press a button and get an instant response, you're not going to get it because they didn't want, well, I'm assuming, though maybe we'll get to talk to somebody about this, they didn't want to, short circuit that footfall and that animation syncing. So it looked like she was really running and her footfalls were there and prepping, and she, like you said, she gets that last footfall to the edge and then pushes off, and the animations look great. For the time, they were amazingly fluid and smooth, and it added to it, but there's that balance of like responsiveness, and it frustrated. I remember the debates when the game was out, and the pro Tomb Raider people were like, oh, this game's amazing, and then the people that were maybe Mario fans or whatever were like, oh, it's too unresponsive, or it's too sluggish or something. So there are definitely two big camps there, but it's a great example of that debate that still goes on today of like, when do you sacrifice what, and it kind of comes down to the goals of each game individually. But it's kind of a fascinating problem because, especially now with the fidelity of games being what they are, and you want them to look as realistic as you can, whether you're doing motion capture or what have you. And so when does gameplay win out, Yeah. So,
well, and I will say that animators mostly fall into the Tomb Raider camp. So,
oh yeah, for sure. They start there.
Right.
Yeah. Because they want it to, it depends on the game, but yeah, definitely.
Well, and because Dark Souls is the take a drink game these days, that's also a game where those interruptions don't really happen. You're committed. Oh, you've decided to do this. That's what you're doing now. You don't get to make a change now just because you want to roll now. Too late. Shouldn't have swung your big axe or whatever. So there's definitely, and that's all just fine as long as you design for that experience in mind, and you have some way of teaching the player, and failing is a perfectly valid teaching tool much of the time, especially in games where the barrier or the cost of failure is really relatively low. You're going to learn pretty quick in something like Demon Souls or Dark Souls that you're not going to be able to interrupt your attacks to block, for example, because you're going to die. You're going to go and do something a little too aggressive, and your windup will be too long, and somebody will stab you. So you make choices at that point with your character about what you want to do to overcome that. And some of that is I need to get better, or I need to be more thoughtful, and some of it is maybe I can make my character faster or use a lighter weapon. So they play in that space deliberately in that game, as a modern example. So
yeah, that's a really good point, because I think that's where the design intent and the animation intent are in good alignment, and intent, like you said, and they lean into it, and that's very intentional. The interesting thing that's dawning on me as you're saying that, though, is in certain cases, both old franchises and old genres, as fidelity increased, and I'm on the flying this, by the way, I haven't thought this through, but as fidelity increased and as the industry progressed, there's still this need and want for playing those old franchises, but back then there were certain decisions that were made that were maybe a little bit more acceptable because of the fidelity of being what it was. But those start fighting more and more as you go on, and the genre or franchise sort of paradigms start breaking a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And Dark Souls being a more modern example where they could align. But, as there's some forgivable things in this game, both level design and level art, et cetera, and some of the animation stuff. But as you go further on, they start conflicting more. And so you have to there's definitely, I think some of the indie games are doing this really well these days, especially in the roguelike kind of category where all of that stuff is really working together well. But if you want to continue Tomb Raider, you want to have some of that fidelity, but then you run into that problem that we did with the reboot of but we want it to feel good. And those are in direct conflict with each other just by the nature of it being a franchise that's been around for a while and a sort of fantasy fulfillment that's been around for a while, but also because, like you said, animation has goals for fidelity and wants it to look really good. And so there's typically solutions, or we even run into it with shooters too, right? Where a shooter like Halo that's been around for a long time, and how does it progress forward in both of those questions, and when does gameplay win over some of that fidelity stuff? So it's a constant, interesting debate, but it didn't dawn on me that some of the legacy of this stuff is really what pits those two things together unintentionally, because it's just been around for so long.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like other ways that games have approached issues like these have been to go more procedural with their animations. I mean, certainly animation systems are way more procedural in a way than they ever were at this time, with multiple blends of different source animations and things like that, so that you get a wider variety of character movement. That's especially prevalent in things like football games or something like that, sports games that have a fair amount of motion capture for sort of different run patterns for football, but you want it to be arbitrary. And so you end up blending lots of different ways that the legs turn and the way that the players move and lean and things like that, to something like Assassin's Creed, which is definitely in the lineage of this game, even though it adds a lot of other stuff kind of on top. But fundamentally, moving around that world, the reason why it works is that they do IK with the arms to figure out where to put them to grab the next bit that you're gonna reach to, or to jump onto, and things like that. So technology can serve a role there as well, because all of that's basically just math and a fair amount of source animation to be able to blend between them. So it's
that's a good point. Yeah, there's definitely that's some of the best engines out there doing this stuff. You're right. There's new solutions that are coming out to help that problem. Yeah, for sure. Well, so jumping gears a little bit, one of the other topics we talked about, maybe hitting a little bit, and I want to actually save some time. I want to ask you about some of your favorite moments in the Peru section and some of the levels, because we won't go blow by blow, but just there's some pretty memorable spots. But on the combat side, we've now had plenty of time with that, and it definitely ramps up some, but we've kind of, for the most part, seen pretty much the extent of the breadth of things for combat. But where's your head at with what you could, I guess, call combat?
Well, I
Don't
mean, there
know.
are things I like about the combat, and a lot of it has to do with the character centric nature of it. I do really appreciate the way her arms move, and how if you turn her, she'll have one arm firing versus both arms,
Yeah,
depending
pretty
on where the
cool.
enemy
Yeah.
is. I love that stuff. It's very simple mathematically. It's just basically it's the same thing they do with her head. It's one joint, one ball joint at the shoulder, and then the basically rods are just pointing in that direction. That's just an inverse matrix. It's the same thing with a camera or the head or whatever to point it in the right direction. And I love that fairly simple trick that's not very expensive math wise is just what they do for all of that, and it makes it look pretty fluid. They really just have to keep track of it's going to cross the line of the body, or it's going to go this far past it, or whatever. So I need to switch to this other animation and kind of drop off the arm and just kind of pull it back. It pulls it back. So there's a lot of really good character moments in her combat, even if the combat is mostly jump away, keep firing the whole time, just lay on that button, just fire. I haven't used any other weapons because that's all that I really feel the need to do. And I just back away from enemies when they suddenly are coming at me. I think the combat is also often very jump scary. They put you in a place where you're going to step out into a room and something's going to hit you right away.
Yeah.
That with the wolves. Later, they do that with the lions or lionesses or whatever they're supposed. Maybe they're supposed
Raptors
to be
too. Yeah.
and the raptors do that as well. So yeah, it kind of happens all over the place. So yeah, I mean the AI is fairly limited. At least they're not. When there are people to fight, they are fine. They're not super interesting, but at least they're also doing projectile damage to you, so you have to sort of manage cover a little bit. Maybe it's not really the focus. The exploration really is, but it's fine for me. It's obviously not first in class of combat of the era, but it's fine. How about you?
It's yeah, and there's not much to add. I mean, it's so simple, and that's why I kind of raised my voice as I was asking the question, because I would barely define it as combat in a sort of traditional design sense. Like the systems and mechanics interplay is pretty minimal, and I feel like kind of going back to the conversation of how the sort of fantasy fulfillment and performance of it is elevated here more than it's similar to our conversation that we just had about the controls animation and sort of and responsiveness of the mobility stuff and jumping and stuff. But the decision to auto lock her arms and weapons on the enemy takes away any sort of mechanical aiming or anything that you would have in a shooter, say, right? So it solves that. And obviously that was probably heavily related to camera and the camera interplay with what they were going to have control over or not.
And the lack of sticks.
Lack of sticks at the time. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. It's all digital sense. Yeah. But I mean, I guess my point is like you have shooters that don't have sticks too, that have aiming mechanics, right? So, they basically made a choice to de-emphasize that. And once you auto lock on, you're not going to have any mechanical depth there. It's really just avoidance at that point, like you said, getting away from things because you don't have to. You're going to hit.
Well, and managing multiple enemies, if there are more than one, you have to.
Which is just stop. Yeah, but that's just
That's just being
minimal.
aware. It's situational awareness. I give a little credit.
A little bit. Yeah, it looks cool, and it's always been neat to do it. But it just wasn't their focus, like you said, and so not necessarily knocking them for that. But the funny thing about it is, I think my memory of it is they do get Core gets some criticism over that over the course of their many games that they did in the franchise, and they start trying to mix it up some, and I don't think it ever quite works because of some of the decisions they made in this game. They kind of have some paradigms that they were sort of stuck with, and as they start fooling around with some of that stuff, it's really, it's really hard to kind of elaborate on. But so that's why, Crystal just went in completely different directions with that stuff. And then the other small note that I made that was always something that stuck in my brain, and never until this podcast and this particular series, I never stopped to actually think about. There was always some weird psychological break that I had with the combat. It didn't dawn on me until we started playing that there's no music during the combat. And I don't know why that has such a weird effect on me, because it adds to this weird ambient explorative kind of tone of the game. And so you're just running down a hall, and the creatures will make their own sounds sometimes. So they have tells and stuff, but they're just running around you and you're just shooting, and there's no music change. There's no drama. It's just very kind of matter of fact. Right. You know what I mean? They're like, here we go. I'm going to just flip around and shoot you, and then you'll be dead, or I'll be dead. And I just never dawned on me why the combat always felt so like, not methodical, but like, I don't know, tonally just downplayed. And I think it's because there's no music or anything. There's no drama to it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And
it's very surgical or something.
I wonder if when you meet up with whatever her name is, the
Natla?
Yeah,
Natla.
I wonder if there's some there or something, like maybe it was a thing that they chose to do so that it would pay off more when this thing happens, but I don't know.
There's not music when you meet the first human guy. That I haven't met the second one yet, but right. Which you'd think was kind of like a boss, but anyway, it's or even with a T-Rex, there's no
right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. That is, and that's someplace where you'd really expect it to be.
That's a huge moment. Yeah. So downplayed music. We talked about the ambient music in the last episode, so maybe it just ended up being a time or budget thing, but it's a funny thing that adds into my kind of psyche about the game for some reason, because I'm so used to music punctuating things in a very specific way, and it's just absent. So it's very kind of meditative is the word I was looking for earlier. But anyway,
no, that's a good point. It's not something I had even really thought about. I guess maybe I tune that stuff out. I'm not really sure why I wouldn't think of that, but I definitely don't. So, interesting.
Yeah. So what about some of your favorite moments so far, at least in Peru? That's as far as I've gotten through. So
well, I mean, obviously the introduction of any of the dinosaurs is really nice. I feel like this time, because of how I came into the area, my T-Rex introduction was not the best it had been.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was okay. But by the time I encountered the T-Rex, I'd found my way to the perfect cave to shoot it from, because it's really deep. There's a lot of caves you can climb up into that it can stick its head in and just like chomp on you. And there's one that's quite deep. And so you just kind of go in there, you shoot it, and when it comes near you, back up, and you can shoot it a whole bunch as it sticks its head in, but it can't get to you. So that, although that's itself a kind of a cool moment of like, oh wow, it's actually putting its head into this cave to try to get at me. That felt like a thing that you didn't see a lot of at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that. There was also, that's the next section I was going to say. I really like Thor's hammer. That's a weird thing. I actually like several of the traps in the first Grease level. I mentioned earlier the boulder coming down. It's such a direct homage, but it also serves that function of both reopening the door behind you, because ultimately you have to leave that way, but also focusing you on what you have to do next to progress. And in fact, that whole little section there where you have collapsing floors and things that have spikes beneath them feels really treacherous in a good capstone sort of way for this section. So that I think most of my favorite bits are in either the Lost Valley or in that final temple.
Mm-hmm.
How about you?
Yeah, I think the man coming back to that, just dropping down into the Lost Valley for the first time, again, and just such great memories of that moment. And then the first time you see the raptors, and then once you see the T-Rex for the first time, one of the top moments of gaming for me,
Yeah,
personally, just of all time, because you just can't believe what's happening, and it's so big.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I
and there's
remember
a
it very
small
well. I
little,
remember talking with, we mentioned Steve Ash, I think, last time. I remember
yeah,
talking with him the day after I saw that and being like, oh my God. He's like, right? I was like, yeah, it's amazing. It really
yeah.
is a good moment. It's a really good reveal when it pays off exactly right.
Yeah, and his face is just in your face. He
Mhm.
kind of leans down at you and then chomps you. If you let him get you, then it's a pretty gruesome death, which I let him do just to make sure I could see it. And just
Sure,
kind of
sure.
stood there. Yeah, it was intentional. But a little small note about the T-Rex, which I thought was interesting and kind of weird, is when he dies, they leave collision for his body, which must have been an added code, right?
Oh yeah.
Wouldn't have been automatic,
Yeah.
but it was such a specific thing because none of the other enemies leave collision. I don't think.
No, they don't.
Yeah, so
Not
it's
that
just a
I've noticed anyway. Yeah.
funny little detail to go after. So then the other favorite moment is also in that level that I actually forgot about how it worked exactly. I remember the kind of the memory of doing it, but then I forgot. Once you get the gears and you turn the gear puzzle on, and you close the waterway, there's that cool secret that you may or may not have gotten, that you can then swim up the waterway to get that one secret. But more importantly, that the fact that you turn the waterfall off, that you've been potentially falling down multiple times
Mhm.
into that pool, and then you turn it off, and then you crawl. Your way out is through behind the waterfall.
Yeah.
And so the sense that this whole level was building up to that one moment of going through this behind this waterfall, I just so like Indiana Jones, just the ultimate Tomb Raider example of this feeling of exploration and just this clockwork nature of these ancient places,
Right.
that I think the whole series rests itself on in
Right.
many ways.
Oh,
So,
and the scale, right? I mean, that's one thing that
mhm.
its descendants have done really well, is to really push the
Yeah,
scale and make
yeah,
these machines ridiculously enormous, right? Of just, oh my God,
hmm
it's not just a big blade that falls into the ground and opens something. It's 10 stories tall, and you have to climb it, right? And
yeah. Scale, good point. That's hits home really a lot more heavily later too in Egypt. I think there's some really big spaces in
yeah,
Egypt.
yeah.
Um,
But
yeah,
I love that stuff, and that it makes it feel like, I mean Egypt's a good place to do it because of the pyramids, right?
hmm
These huge monuments that human hands built, that people
hmm
can barely believe that human hands built because of their size and their scale. And I love that stuff. I mean, I think that's my favorite part of games like these, is to see just the spectacle of an enormous, impossible object that you're going to climb all around, or maybe move and use as part of your traversal of an area. I love that stuff. So
yeah,
um, I think there's some
yeah,
other great stuff that comes later. But
yeah. We'll talk. We should talk about them every each episode. And all.
yeah, and hit
Um,
the high notes.
yeah.
All right. Well,
So yeah,
let's stop there. And we had one other topic we were going to try to hit this time, but I guess we'll do that. Well, I guess we sort of touched on the gears and the puzzle there. There'll probably be more of that we'll want to talk about as time goes on. So puzzling is definitely,
yeah. The puzzles get heavier. Yeah, we'll hit that next time.
come back to that. I already issued one correction, but I wanted to issue another one, and mea culpa. I jumped in because I always want to be able to say Tim's wrong. And in this case, I was wrong to say he was wrong. And
Oh
that's the
no.
0451 code. And I got this from somebody tweeted at Dev Game Club. And I want to make sure I get this name right. It was, oh, hello, trying to find that. Crash Translation, who said the 0451 goes back to the original System Shock. And he was right. I was thinking it was the first Warren Spector game, but of course that was System Shock and not Deus Ex, where that started. So it goes back to that one. So I had the right reason I was thinking. I just didn't think it all the way through. So anyway, mea culpa, mea mega culpa, I guess. I don't know. So there's that.
Good.
I already talked about the PS1.
Very, very honorable of you.
Yeah, well, we do what we can for the listeners. Not
yeah, he wouldn't do that normally, everybody. So
yeah. I'm going to take the first review and then have an email. It's a quick one. It's just from DCAB11, if that is your real name. He says, amazing perspective. It's awesome to get the view from DGC, especially with games I'm unable to play. Playing along with them is fun too. Hopefully many more game playthroughs in the future. Let's hope. I mean, that can only mean good things for my longevity. So I hope there's thousands of them. But yes, thank you for the review. We love to have those via the iTunes store. It's a great way for us to reach new listeners and keep doing this thing that we do. You, sir, have an email.
I do, from our friend Zimmy Finger. Subject, oh boy, I have some thoughts. Uh-oh. Once Zimmy's subject says that, then I worry. Brett, during one of the episodes, you casually threw out that it's kind of funny how we classify genres in games and how film genres describe narrative, while game genres describe experience. I would like to point out the other place genre is classified by experience is music. To go deeper, I think both music and games share more similarities. Music is a medium in which the sound can overshadow the lyrics and narrative, much like how game mechanics can overshadow narrative. For example, Beethoven's Fifth and Tetris, in parentheses, both beloved, both without a concrete story. But I believe game mechanics can give us stories that have been unexplored by other mediums. I think one of the reasons you get those dumb essays about how game mechanics can't is because we haven't had a lot of experience telling a story in the second person style. To cut a longer rant short, I'm just wondering if you guys have any go-to examples of when game mechanics and story merged beautifully, or what you think are some unique hurdles in games when trying to tell a story. Anyway, cheers. P.S. I had a big stupid grin on my face when Tim read my review. Good, Zimmy. You deserve it. Very appreciative. It's a classic moment. Classic Dev Game Club moment. Forever immortalized. Yeah, so what do you think?
I mean, the one go-to example people often point to is BioShock, because it takes the inherent nature of games in which you sort of have to follow what the level designer or the designer has decided that you're going to do, and makes that an inherent part of the story, right? The would you kindly, and you're going to do it because that's how the game progresses. I think that's kind of a classic example of how at least sort of the macro design of games and the narrative can work together. I also particularly like Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, in which the overarching narrative is that of the prince telling his beloved the story of basically of how they met. And whenever, and they tie that in lots of little ways where whenever he runs out of the sands and can't rewind and ultimately dies, he'll say something like, oh, no, it didn't happen that way. And it'll go back to some earlier checkpoint or something like that. And that's kind of an interesting way to wrap this problem up a bit. A later Prince of Persia game, I want to say 2004 version, I think that's what it was. Xbox.
Which one?
The Xbox 360 title that had that sort of cell shading look.
With the companion character?
With the companion.
I think it was 2008, wasn't it?
Was it that late? It might have been that late.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on the date for sure. Whenever that was. That was another one where I felt like in getting rid of the death altogether, they could just lean into their story a little bit more and not have it be a story of failure, but a story of companionship. So those are a couple that just are coming to me off the top of my head. I should have thought about this more, but I didn't. Any that you think of?
Well, you always get to pre-read these and think about them, but I never do. I always have on the fly. Yeah, I think we've really probably talked about this before, but my go-to kind of, I consider it a cheating answer at this point that I don't know, maybe can be debated, but I still think that Shadow of the Colossus and Eco to some degree, but even more Shadow, and it's a bit of a cheating answer because the story is so minimalistic in those games. But I often, though I may not always agree with what the characters' choices are. I mean, it's hard. Like in Shadow's case, there's a bit of a difficulty to justifying what you're doing sometimes because they want to kind of make you feel bad for the creatures and stuff. But the sense of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it compared to what the mechanics and stuff are, I feel like are pretty well merged together in that game in particular. But again, I think it benefits from being so simple in the story and narrative sense. And there's a lot of filling in the blanks yourself. I think the games that allow you to do that are the ones that succeed best at this, versus spoon feeding you and hand holding you a bunch of extra stuff that that often gets in the way of the mechanics. But on the fly, that's the only one I can think of.
But I guess, I mean, now that you've been talking, a couple others that have come to mind. Far Cry 2, I think merges its fundamental, like everything about, and I'm thinking more again on the macro level there, but everything that you need to accomplish in that game, you have to accomplish by shooting a bunch of guys to get the, I forget what they're called, but like the safe houses or something like that, the places where you can save and re-equip and rest and things like that throughout the world are all, you have to fight your way through to get there. They're held basically. And there's sort of a sense of taking territory, which matches the overall narrative of that sort of guerrilla / civil war going on in that country. So again, it's kind of at a macro level and not necessarily the moment to moment, but I do like that your moment to moment violence echoes sort of that higher level systemic violence that's going on in that country. And then Planescape, which is a game that we've played, where again the death mechanics merge really well. And the fact that you don't know your history and you're sort of uncovering these stories about yourself and these abilities that you had at one time are a really nice framing for that story about what makes a man, right? Or what can change a man.
We talked so much about that, and luckily had Chris on to talk about it as well. And they cracked so many nuts when it comes to the RPG ludonarrative dissonance problem with that game in particular, that game's story. And that's a really good example.
So there's a handful. Hopefully those are
good.
Those are useful.
It's a good point about music too.
For sure.
Never thought about it that way, but I think it's a really insightful. Yeah, I'll definitely, because we all so often use movies and games and pit them against each other, but thinking a little differently about that with music. That's why I love the medium. It's such an interesting, weird, hard to compare to anything else kind of thing, because the audience is a participant in the medium versus definitely audiences are participants in all the other mediums in some way too. But like he said, mechanics can tell stories too, and a lot of that is because the player is controlling the mechanics. So it's interesting.
I mean, the unique hurdle in games is the player, right? I mean, otherwise you'd just be doing things that you're doing other media. You could read, you could listen to music, you could watch a movie, right? But all of that is sort of encapsulated in games at different points, and so the big thing is that the player can mess things up. And in fact, that's what makes games that are comic in nature particularly hard, because you lose timing often, and that is critical to joke telling. So the way comedy works in games is actually even harder than it is in other media, and comedy's already hard. It doesn't get really enough kudos for how difficult it is to be a really good comedian and make somebody laugh. I think that's underserved by, for example, the Academy every year. That rarely are comedies up for Best Picture, and they almost never win. I'm not sure I could remember the last time a comedy won Best Picture. So yeah, that's another thing I think about. Anyway,
cool. All right, you want to tie it up there?
Oh, I know what it was. It was Gone with the Wind. That was the last comedy.
Oh, yeah. That thing is hilarious.
Oh, man. Whew.
I'm in stitches every time. Yeah.
What a hoot, that movie. Anyway.
That scene on the porch, it was just hilarious.
Oh, man. And with all the burning. Anyway, I can say that. I'm south of the Mason-Dixon line, I think. I am.
Yeah. You're not even sure.
It is. It's
That's something you should know, I think.
Actually do know that.
Okay.
I was doing that for effect. Like the gag about Gone with the Wind. It's all tying together. Okay.
Good. That's comedy, folks.
There, yeah. Such as it is. It's all in the timing. See, it's all in the... Okay. Yeah. So, next time, we're going to play through Greece and Egypt.
Well, I am, yeah.
I was going to say, that means you.
Yep.
You, sir, and Egypt. I am going to play through a little bit of Greece and all of Egypt, and then we will wrap up with Atlantis. We may have a little bit of a break this month because Tim's got a little bit of extended leave he's taking. It will either be a week or two. We shall see as it approaches. It'll help us line up some other stuff down the road a little bit better anyway. So we'll probably just do that. We'll let you know. It won't be next week. Next week we'll have a show for you. In the meantime, you can send us email like Zimmy did at devgameclub@gmail.com. I'm really not at Twitter at Brett_Douville at all. I've been staying away from Twitter for like a good 10 days.
Good for you.
I have, however, started blogging again, and you can find that at brettdouville.com. The latest update is a good discussion about the pleasures of roller derby. So swing by brettdouville.com and check that out.
Quite an interesting topic. All right.
It is a terrific thing, and you should go to the roller derby. You can find Tim on Twitter at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
As I mentioned earlier, you can also find us at DevGameClub. I am monitoring that, so go ahead and keep sending us your thoughts there. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week. For now, good night.
Good night.